thrilled to have with us today David King, who is the director of Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. He's also a professor at Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy. David is an author of numerous published articles and two books, including his most recent, God's Internationalist. He's also an ordained minister who's passionate about research and speaking on the intersections of faith and giving. David, it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
Can you share a little bit about Lake's work and your role there?
Sure. Lake Institute has been around a little over 15 years, specifically focused at the School of Philanthropy on the intersections of this dynamic relationship between faith and giving, how they inspire and inform one another. We do a lot of research and scholarship, some of what we might talk about today, as well as a lot of education and training, working with pastors, religious leaders of nonprofits, maybe fundraisers of religious organizations.
So Horizons is a big fan of your work and the Lake Institute, which is why we partner with you to promote participation in this COVID-19 congregational study. You all have just released the results. What's the single most important takeaway for you from this study?
I was struck that I would say two things. One, that congregations are not doing having as difficult a time with their giving as we might have expected. And while 41% of congregations saw a decline in their giving, that puts the majority of congregations being able to sustain or even increase their giving at this time.
David, one of your big findings was that total giving among churches declined 4.4% in your study period from February to June 2020 versus 2019. But you also found that 28% of churches report that their giving is up, 31% are stable, so 59% are either up or stable, and yet there was an overall decline. How do you reconcile this?
Yeah, that's a great point, Joe. While we saw a number of congregations growing or sustaining their giving during this period, those that were declining overall were declining at sort of larger numbers. And so there was a bit of a tipping point, a haves and have-nots. And so the overall aggregate congregational giving number was down 4.4%, even if looking at it congregation by congregation, you saw a difference between those that were declining or growing. Some that were declining quite drastically, while those who might be growing were growing at slower paces. So overall, we saw a decline in giving across all congregations.
So you also reported that 52% of your study churches reported increases in attendance, and yet you called out that congregations who worship less than 50 were, as a group, showing a decrease. Can you speak into why you think that occurred?
You point out that a majority of congregations did see a growth in their participation, in-person services versus sort of an online or viewership during the pandemic. And many other surveys have pointed this out as well. It was most difficult for the smaller congregations. Our theory is really that the infrastructure that many mid or large congregations had around technology, the ability to shift quickly to Zoom accounts or Facebook Live, was a luxury that many congregations had that the smallest congregations did not. So the smallest congregations did see the largest declines in participation and giving, but oftentimes might be that many were drawn to the larger congregations that had the resources to quickly pivot and put services online in a variety of formats.
So, David, 14% of the churches reported a reduction in staff. Do you see this number increasing as PPP funds are used? I believe your report called out 65% of churches in your study actually took PPP funds.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the PPP funds that congregations received over the spring and into the early fall made a big difference in allowing them to continue their ministries and to continue to hang on to staff and put them to good use in their congregations and beyond into their communities. What happens as those funds are used up is really a great question. We asked them that question. We asked congregations, if these financial uncertainties continue, where will you cut funds? and only 19% pointed towards furloughing or laying off staff. And so I do think we'll see that number grow if the financial uncertainties continue. But it seems to be one of the sort of lower priority items for congregations. I think congregations are finding other ways to put staff to use, maybe changing their roles in this pandemic and trying to hang on and care for their people as much as possible.
I get to speak to a lot of churches each week. And so many of the data points in here really reinforce what I've experienced, what the broader group of our Horizon strategists have experienced. One point did surprise me, and that is not a single congregation indicated that they expected to increase their budget next year. And yet 28% are finding themselves in a growing giving situation. What do you make of that?
Well, I think those 52% of congregations that hope to maintain their current budget is a bit of a, could be seen as an optimistic approach, a glass half full type of measure. While some congregations are obviously pointing to increased giving or sustained giving, these next 3 to 6 months at the end of 2020 into the next year have a lot of continued uncertainties around them. A bit of a paralysis as we're in the midst of a polarized election, economic anxieties about where the stock market and other types of economic indicators might lead. I think a lot of people are hesitant to make big plans, just not knowing what the future looks like. And so I think for many, holding steady is a win for next year, and the uncertainties preclude them to try to grow in any particular direction just yet.
David, you indicate that 48% of churches are expecting a decrease of 5 to 10%. Your sister organization puts out a report, Giving USA, which is sort of the baseline for most of us that are in this work in regard to charitable giving. And so we've been seeing a decline in the overall size of church budgets, shifting giving from religion to other charitable giving. So I'm wondering what you think about this 48%. Is this a trend that was already in place that has been accelerated because of COVID, or is this something new?
Yeah, I think this is a both and, Joe. I think for many, COVID has accelerated what was already a trend. And what we know about religious giving is that it works differently than most charitable giving. And so you pointed out, oftentimes in recessions, religious giving doesn't decline at the same rates that other charitable giving declines. So giving to congregations usually declines in a lower percentage than across other nonprofits. So I think what we're seeing is this larger giving trend is shifting. So congregational giving in particular has been changing for a while. As you note with Giving USA, that religious giving sector has been is by far the largest, but it's been shrinking. And we also know that the number of households that give each year has also begun to shrink. And givers to congregations most often are your average givers. It's not the 1% that are making drastically large mega gifts that other philanthropy has experienced. And so I think as that number of households shrinks, as the options to give to a variety of nonprofits has grown, congregational giving is bearing the brunt of that increased competition and that changes in religious identity. And so what we're oftentimes seeing is lower giving to congregations. But at the same time, congregations are revising or reframing their budgets and doing more with less, thinking about their ministries in new ways, thinking about their partnerships in new ways. That probably is a trend that was clearly ahead of COVID. And I think, as you point out, it is accelerated into a new normal that we might expect in the coming years.
Recently, we had Mark DeMaz on with us speaking about the need for churches to diversify their income streams beyond tithes and offerings. I know that you are engaged in a work called Shifting Ground Initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your thoughts about the need for churches to diversify income in view of the giving trends that we're seeing?
Yeah, Joe, this work we're doing around shifting ground really is focused a lot on sort of the economics of ministry. And we talk about it maybe in three or four ways. One is just the financial literacy question that we've done a much better job of working with lay members and clergy about their own knowledge about finances. Number two, where we spend a lot of our time really is on congregational stewardship and generosity, thinking about that type of work. But the third, where we're really more interested in and continuing to expand, is thinking about the variety of revenue streams that congregations might tap into. Thinking about sort of in an asset-based approach, thinking about the strengths and assets that they have in their buildings, in their networks, thinking about the individuals who are leaders, entrepreneurs, business people within their congregation, while tithes and offerings, sort of typical traditional stewardship that the church has relied on for the last 50, 60 years, is still continues to be important. It may be one of a diverse stream revenue, using their space, using other sort of entrepreneurial operations or talents, not only to support the life of the church, but in some ways used as a way to expand their ministry and mission as well. And so we think this is actually a growing challenge, but also a strength for many congregations in their mission and ministry as well.
David, we've talked about now giving, we've talked about worship, we've talked about budgeting, but we haven't yet talked about the impact of discipleship. At Horizons, we think that generosity is actually a byproduct of the discipleship process. I recently had an opportunity to talk to Debbie Nixon at Church of the Resurrection, and they've done a study on the correlation between giving and engagement, and that's pretty profound connection that they have at their church. Would you like to speak into the impact of discipleship on your study findings and the future of giving and generosity and faith?
Sure, I'd love to, Joe. This is one of our core messages at Lake Institute, just like yours at Horizon, thinking about shaping generous givers, not only so that our organizations can be strong and live into the mission and ministry that they're called to, but also to cultivate generous individuals. We know from all studies that our School of Philanthropy has done outside the religious space here at Lake Institute that generous individuals are healthier, physically, emotionally, socially. There are all kinds of byproducts of living a generous life. But most importantly, I think for those of us who are really engaged in the faith-based space, it's something that we're called to. It's a muscle that we can grow through exercise and grow into over time. And for our religious leaders, I think that's a core calling. Just as we ask or invite people to develop a prayer life, to develop a life around reading scripture or forming their families in the faith, the same is true for generosity. And I think well beyond our church institutions, when we're thinking about kingdom work, the generosity seeds we could sow will be some of the greatest gifts that I think we can offer to the communities in which we work.
So, David, we're going to share this video with the 50 or so thousand pastors and church leaders that follow our Resilient Leadership series. What advice do you have for them, and what words of encouragement would you have?
Joe, my advice for pastors and religious leaders is really not to go on this journey alone. So we've talked several times already today about bringing leaders alongside you, whether it's and thinking about reopening, whether it's thinking about diversifying revenue streams, and it's just your own support. So no leader can be an expert in all the types of skills necessary to succeed in running an organization as complex as a church. Uh, but there's so many people around you, and you as a pastor, as a religious leader, are gifted, particularly in bringing those people together and asking the questions. So I would encourage any religious leader to ask those questions, to be scared about what the future might look like, even while being realistic about the new normal and anxieties and complexities that we're finding in the space in which we live here in 2020 and into 2021. So if we can take on that challenge, bring others around us, and know that God has equipped us to do this work together, I'm quite optimistic about not only the future of the church, but the leaders that God's called into this work.
David, thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, Horizons is a huge fan of Lake Institute, the work of the School of Philanthropy and the Lilly Foundation. As people want to follow you more, we put your website up on the screen. They can follow you on Twitter as well. Blessings on your work, and we look forward to collaborating in the future. Thank you.